Hello and welcome to the last and final story time of The Wild Robot. And sadly, there's not a third book, so this is going to be our last time with Roz. Let's hope they get home, because that's where we left them. They wanted to go home. Chapter 86, The Flight. Sitting on the pavement, glinting into the sun, was a sleek white airship. For so long, those white ships had filled the robot with dread. Now one was about to solve all her problems. The door hummed open and Dr. Mulvo, Roz and Brightbill climbed aboard. Once they were comfortable, the woman spoke to the airship. "Take us to the island where Rosum Unit 713 was found." The engines fired up and the ship lifted off. It floated high into the air, turned to the north and started cruising above the city. The three of them quietly watched the buildings and street pass below. Their city seemed to go on forever, but as they flew faster and further, it slowly gave way to towns and countrysides. They crossed the hard edge of the coastline, and then there was only the ocean, and the ship, and the sky. There they are. You can see the three of them in the window. The ocean was deep. However, scattered throughout the dark depths were shallow areas, sandbars, reefs, islands just under the waves. In places, bizarre rock formations stuck up from the shallows, or were they ruins of old buildings? The mysterious shapes faded behind the airship and were replaced with more dark depths. The ship flew on for hours and hours. Gradually, fluffy clouds came into view on the edge of the horizon. Beneath the clouds was a faint smudge of green. The island. It grew closer and bigger, and Roz was gazing out at all the places she'd missed. The rocky shore, the mountain and the waterfall, the forest and the meadows and the ponds. The air blasted towards the ground as the ship lowered itself onto the grassy clearing. It gently touched down. The engine powered off. Chapter 87, The Homecoming. The airship's door hummed open and our robot stepped outside. Everything was still and silent, but Roz knew hidden animals were watching, and she greeted them with a mighty roar. "Animals of the island, I have returned. I may look different, but I promise you I am your old friend, Roz." Her words boomed across the island, but the only response was her own voice echoing back. The wild robot needed to be wilder, so she reached down and started smearing handfuls of mud across her body. Then she pressed clumps of weeds and flowers onto her muddy coating until she looked more like her old wild self. Brightbill fluttered out from the airship and perched on Roz's shoulder. He shook his tail feathers and squawked, "It's true! This robot is my mother! Come and see for yourself!" Silence. And then the bushes began to rustle. Faces began poking out from the trees. Animals began scurrying and trotting and flying into the meadow. At first, they moved cautiously, confused as to how their new robot could be their old friend. But they saw her wild appearance and they heard her wild voice. And news began spreading across the island. Roz was back. A crowd of friendly creatures gathered around our robot. There were Brightbill's flocks and the beavers and the deer family and Finks the fox and Swooper the owl. Bears came lumbering down from the hills and fish jumped up from ponds and vultures circled above. Even the nocturnal creatures crawled from their burrows into daylight to join the celebration. Oh, how good it feels to return from a long journey and find your friends and family waiting for you. But reader, sometimes we return to find things aren't exactly as we left them. As you know, the wilderness can be a harsh place, and while Roz was away, it had claimed her share of friends. The robot saw the raccoons, Lumpskin and Bumpkin, but not Rumpskin. Nor did she see Broadfoot the moose, or Dig Down the groundhog. Other creatures were missing as well, and so, like many of Homecomings, this one was bittersweet. Chit-Chat, the squirrel, came bounding through the grass, chattering on as usual. "I always knew you'd come back to us, Roz, but I'd never imagined you'd gained so much weight, and although I guess I've gained a little weight myself, anyway, you'll have to tell me about your adventures when I get the chance. I'm sorry for talking so much, I'm just so excited to see you again." Geese and beavers and deer and fish and squirrels and owls and bears and turtles and otters and raccoons and woodpeckers and possums and moose and foxes and every kind of creature from every corner of the island were coming to welcome back their dear friend, Roz and Brightbill. And watching it all from the airship was Dr. Mulvo. What a weird sight that would be. Chapter 88. The Final Farewell. Everyone, I would like you to meet the woman who designed me. Roz walked over to the strange creature standing by the ship's doorway. For most of the island animals, it was the first time seeing a human. They squinted and sniffed and whispered to each other, trying to understand how such a frail old woman could create such a big, strong robot. Dr. Mulvo started speaking softly to Roz, and then Roz started speaking loudly to the crowd of animals. My designer has asked me to translate her words for you, said the robot. The following words are not mine, they are hers. The crowd settled down and listened. Thank you, island animals, for saving Roz. Without your help, she would have died a long time ago. But you were not only her rescuers, you were her teachers. You taught her to be wild, and she needed all her wildness to survive, both in your world and in mine. Probably should be doing this in Dr. Mulvo's voice, actually, even though it's Roz saying. I'll do it in Dr. Mulvo, although it's Roz saying it. As I look around at this wild paradise, I finally understand why Roz tried so hard to get back here. She does not belong with robots and humans. She belongs here on the island with all of you. We cannot risk others learning about this place. That is why I will soon leave and I will never return. But I promise to keep your island a secret, so that all of you can live in peace. And I will spend the rest of my days filled with wonder at the miracle that is our wild robot. The meadow fell silent. A flurry of wings beat, and Brightbill landed in the grass near Dr. Mulvo. He gazed up at the woman deep into her eyes, and then he bowed his head. Then the other geese in his flock bowed their heads. Crownpoint, the buck, bowed his head. Pintail the possum bowed, Mr. Beaver and Mrs. Beaver bowed, the lizards bowed, followed by the turtles and the frogs. Like a wave rolling through the crowd, more animals bowed until every head was lowered. They were showing respect for the woman who had created their dear friend Roz, and who had brought her back to them. Dr. Mulvo turned to Roz. Do you understand why I can not ever return? She said, her eyes glistening. It is for your own good. I understand, said the robot. I only wish we had gotten to know each other a little better. Dr. Mulvo smiled and pulled Roz into a hug. She didn't mind the robot's coat of mud and grass. She wrapped in each other's arms. They both felt something like love. You're a wild robot, said the woman. Go and be wild. Chapter 89. The Departure. Dr. Mulvo stepped aboard the airship and the door hummed closed. A moment later, the engines fired up and the crowd of wild animals backed away. Then the ship rose above the island, turned to the south and disappeared into the sky. And there it goes. Two pages left. Chapter 90. The Island. Our story ends on an island where a robot was returning to her wild way of life. Roz had escaped from the world of humans, and now she was free to be her true self again. She could think and speak and do whatever she desired, and right now what she desired was to simply watch the sunset. With Brightbill on her shoulder, she hiked past trees and meadows and streams and climbed up the mountain to the very highest point of the island. Then our friends sat on the slanted rocks of the peak and watched the sunset slowly sink behind the ocean. If you're like me, reader, you still have lots of questions. How long will Roz live? Will she ever see another human or another robot? What joys and sorrows lie ahead of her? Roz still had some questions too, but now she also had some answers. Our robot knew where she had come from. She knew the life she was supposed to live, and she knew the life she wanted to live. As Roz sat with Brightbill, she slowly turned her head, scanning the island, taking it all in. The last rays of sunlight streaked across the treetops below. Animals scurried through the shadows. The air was fresh with the scent of flowers and the salt water. The sky began darkening. The crickets began chirping. The sky began twinkling. Everything was just right. Roz felt safe and happy and loved. The wild robot was home. And there they are. Right, that's the end of the story, but there is that much of an epilogue. Okay, so the bit that comes after the story. There was one of these in The Unforgotten Coat where it kind of told us the story behind it. But this goes back to Hilltop Farm. Autumn had returned to Hilltop Farm. The pasture was coated with frost, and the cows were out there, grazing on their last few tufts of fresh grass. Soon they strolled up to the parlour from another milking. Their routine never changed. Mr. Sharif was sitting in his pickup truck with his dog. The man stared out the window across the field at his new robot. He was keeping a close eye on her. TechLab had promised him this one wouldn't run away, but he didn't trust her yet. These days, the children spent most of their free time working on the farm. Jad had a way with cows. Jaya liked the tools and the machines. They were walking through the farm buildings together when they heard honking sounds in the sky and a flock of geese glided down to the pond. Remember, they said, "We'll try and let you know that Roz gets back." For weeks, geese had been stopping on their migrations, but there was something different about this flock. They flew in perfect formation and were led by a small, graceful goose. Wonder who that could be. The flock calmly floated on the water. After a while, the leader shook his tail feathers, beat his wings, and fluttered over to Jaya and Jad. The goose stood in front of the children. He gazed deep into their eyes. Then he craned his neck around, plucked out one of his feathers, and laid it on the ground by their feet. Jaya and Jad looked at each other and smiled. The children had been waiting for this moment. They always wanted to know how Roz's story would end, and now they finally knew. The wild robot was back where she belonged. And that is the end. Hope you enjoyed it. That's now the 4th time I've read that book, but I enjoy it every time. And I hope you enjoy it too. And we're going to have to find a new book to read.